When I say the word stock and bond, what actually comes to mind? Do you get scared? Is it something you don't know? What does it actually mean? How do you buy it? What are things like diversification, mutual fund, stock market, bonds? What do those actually mean? Well, if you're tuning in today, you actually saw the thumbnail. You're here to learn, and I'm gonna actually do my best to simplify some of these concepts. So the first thing I wanna go over is, what does something mean when you hear compound interest? That's point number one. We hear about that when it comes to savings. We hear about that when it comes to investing, but what does that actually mean? It seems like it's a very difficult concept to learn and to think about. If you look at the description here in this slide I've got, you actually see investor one, we start at 25, investor two starts at 35. Why is there such a difference? Really simple. Investor one, they didn't keep investing. They didn't go after a series, no more investments after age 34. They got cut off. Investor one just stopped investing. Investor two started at 35, but they invested $5,000 each year for 30 years in a row until reaching 65. Well, one thing that investor one did, they had a 10-year head start. That's a 10-year head start. That's huge. That's monumental. If you have a 10-year head start, you're going to be way ahead of the game. And that's one thing I want to continue to harp on is you must start early. Investor two in this case did have a 30-year time horizon, but because they had such a time lapse or a time debt, as I'll call it, they're really digging themselves out of a hole. Now, if I go over here, you'll actually see one of these Forbes articles I'm going to open up. We're going to go through it real quick, and all it does is walk you through what it's like from simple interest to compound interest. And one thing I want you to remember is you don't need to necessarily remember all these formulas, but simple interest is I'm just earning interest on what I put in, and that's it. Compound interest is I'm earning interest on interest. So it starts to snowball and it starts to get much bigger. One of the things that I like to remember is my 401k. So the first 100,000 that I put in there was really tough. After the first 100,000, things started to snowball. I've earned interest on interest on interest on interest, but that can also work the other way. So in this case, student loans, mortgages, and other loans, personal loans, that can be a really big detriment to your financial freedom and your financial future if you're not paying attention. One of the things with mortgages is sometimes the first few years, if not the first 10 years, you may be paying mostly interest only and very little on the principal. And then about halfway through, it's called the golden cross, where you'll hit the inflection point where you're paying more on your principal than you are on interest. I'm going to do a separate video on that in terms of interest versus principal, PMI, and insurance costs. But really, all you need to know is follow these 4 steps. Give yourself time, like I talked about before. Pay down your debt. Compare the APYs, the annual percentage yield of what you're able to earn on your money, and then see how often it compounds. So in this case, you want your savings products to compound as quickly as possible and your debts to compound as infrequently as possible. I'm gonna also link all the description put these in the description below, as well as the link to this webpage, so you can always reference it and go back. Okay, so we talked about compound interest. What's number 2? Diversification. All right, who remembers GameStop about a year and a half ago? I think it was about a year and a half ago, where a Wall Street Bets forum on Reddit actually outsmarted some of the smartest hedge funds on Wall Street and ran up massive returns on the short positions of what Wall Street was doing on the backs of them. That was really good for the people on Wall Street Bets and Reddit, really bad for the hedge funds and the short sellers who got completely squeezed and wiped out. If you look here, GameStop's probably one of the biggest examples of not being diversified enough and not looking at your portfolio and making sure that you have the diversification you need. And by the way, this doesn't just include stocks and bonds or ETFs. This could be real estate. This could be venture capital. This could be private equity. This could be a number of different things. One of the things I want you to remember is putting all your eggs in one basket is extremely, extremely risky. So in this case, the people that did own GameStop that did very well, today would probably say, yeah, it's great. I'm glad that we did it. However, all it took was one wrong move, and GameStop's kind of a corner case, so is AMC. But if you look at this article, one of the things it talks about is how risky it was to not be diversified, and the people that ran this and ran up all those and ran GameStop all the way up, contrary to what the short sellers were doing, were taking massive, massive risks that they don't need to take. It happened to work out for them there, but it's not a guarantee, and it's almost like going to Vegas and pulling the slot machine. One of the things that I'm going to look at here is GameStop was the second most traded U.S. stocks among all retailers during this time. So, what was the bigger issue with this? Well, again, like I said down here, the short side, or the side that said, hey, we're expecting the stock to go down. It can go down to zero. Well, the stock actually ended up going up. The stock can go to infinity. There's no limit on how high a stock can go, but it can only go to zero. It cannot go negative. So if you were all in on something like that, you took an extreme amount of risk for not a lot of upside, because your inverse of a short sell is that the price continues to go up to infinity, but it can only go down to zero. So let's look at number 3. So number 3 outside of diversification is inflation. Everyone's talking about inflation right now. Inflation's been burning up for about 2.5 years or so, probably closer to 3 since COVID hit. I put a warning label up here at the top. Just because the government tells you inflation is going down does not actually mean inflation is going down. Think for yourself, look at your receipts, your credit card statement, and your balances. Really simple way to see how inflation affects you. Take a receipt from a year ago when you go to Costco, look at what you bought, go to Costco today and look at what you bought and see what it costs. So if a bag of apples is $2 a year ago and a bag of apples, the same apples, is $3 today, that is 50% inflation. If it's $2.50 and it was $2, that's 25% inflation. Just take the difference, divide it by the principal, and you're good to go. I think we all know inflation is raging. Going to grocery stores, getting gas, insurance, just normal costs of goods sold today. Everything is continuing to go up. But what causes inflation, right? Well, inflation occurs when prices and services continue to rise and things are out of whack. So your money's purchasing power decreases over time. That's why I've told people time and time again, those that shove their money under their mattress are they're gonna have none of it. Because while in 10 or 20 years, you might pull that money out of your mattress and say, I still have my $1, the buying power of that dollar has drastically decreased. So you have two choices. One, you can continue to stack money in your mattress or throw it into a low yield checking account making 0.01 while the banks take advantage of you and loan your money out. Or 2, you invest it. And by invest, I don't mean a Wall Street bets and a GameStop type of thing. I mean actually invest in sound, diversified portfolios with things like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, real estate, private equity, whatever. I've had several videos on my channel. Go back through and watch on how to build a money-making portfolio from a beginner's perspective, an intermediate, and an advanced. All I want you to remember from this is there's inflation and there's deflation. And deflation is where the cost of things continues to go down, not up. Those are things like electronics. Those could be things like tires. Those could be things like computers. So over time, the price to manufacture a computer, a TV, a camera continues to go lower. That's due to quantities, economies of scale. But other things like healthcare, tuition, housing, those continue to go up, and they're actually outpacing inflation. So really another thing to remember is when it comes to your wages, if you're a W-2 or even if you're a 1099, if you're getting a 2 or 3% raise every year, you're not even beating inflation. So when you do get that raise, just understand that the purchasing power of your money a year ago was probably 20% less than what it is today. So you need to make 20% more this year just to keep up with what you could afford last year. So don't forget that. This is an article, again, it's linked. It walks basically through what we've seen from an inflation perspective and where it thinks things are going. So again, like I talked about, there's 3 broad causes from an inflation standpoint. There's demand pull, there's cost push, and there's expectations. It's wild to think there are just as many people making speculative bets on the market from an inflation standpoint as there are on the UFC fight, what Google stock is going to do tomorrow, what the IMF's going to do with interest rates, and is the Fed going to actually do another hike before the end of the year. All this is priced into inflation expectations, but there's demand, which is pulling inflation, and then there's cost, which is pushing. Demand basically says how much demand is there for a product, and then what's the cost for it. So if there's no demand for Ferraris, the price of Ferraris is going to go down. If there's a huge demand for Ferraris, the price is going to go up. If you think back to the peak of COVID, things like Rolexes, expensive watches, sports cars, and high-end real estate was surging because people had the expectation that there wasn't going to be enough to go around. What did that do? That drove prices up. Same thing with inflation. If I look down here, what did a cup of coffee cost? I remember my grandfather telling me back in the 1940s and 50s, maybe it was even the 30s, he could go to a movie for 10 cents, and that was the movie ticket, chocolate, and some popcorn for 10 or 15 cents. You can't get anything for 15 cents anymore, except, you know, it used to be, hey, give me, here's a quarter, get a cup of coffee. Well, now a cup of coffee that was a quarter back in 1970 is $1.85. If it was $2.25, you're looking at 1,000%, or you're looking at 100% inflation. Sorry. So again, same cup of coffee, 1970, same size, but it went from a quarter to $1.85. And in another 50 years, that same cup of coffee, if you look at that trajectory, will be $6 for this cup, and it was a quarter back in 1970. That's how inflation works. The next one, stocks and bonds. I did talk about this earlier, and I've talked about this at numerous on my channel, but stocks represent ownership in a company, and bonds are simply loans from a company or government. You've heard of T-bills or treasury bills. Those are loans that the government sells to you. So it says, hey, give us your $10,000. We're guarantee you 5% back. They take the $10,000. And ideally, in a perfect world, they use that to make the country better. Although I think we all know that's kind of not happening as much as it probably should. Stocks are riskier because you're not guaranteed a profit than bonds. But bonds are lower risk, but they do offer safer investments. And just to understand what you're doing, I've talked ad nauseum about the 70-30 or the 80-20 portfolio, where that's 70% stocks, 30% bonds, or 80% stocks, 20% bonds. It doesn't have to be that. You want to do your own calculations, look at your risk parity, look at your time horizon, and look at your net exposure to risk. There's a video linked here, and it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy. So for those that actually want to dive into that, it does a really good job in about 3 minutes of going over there. The differences are, again, stocks and bonds are some of the most common. But if you look here, I'm going to pull up this article. I think NerdWallet does a pretty good job here of explaining what the differences are. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Although you look at stocks and bonds, you've got one is equity, which is stock, and debt, which is bond. Capital gains, so the gains on a stock could be infinite. Look at something like an Nvidia, Tesla, Google, a Palantir, a Microsoft, any of those. Look at Pfizer, look at Merck during COVID. Their prices spiked because there was extreme demand for their products. Prices for Merck and Pfizer, Amgen, Lilly's not one of those because of their diabetes drug, but Pfizer and Merck and some of the other ones that did really well during the pandemic because people needed their vaccines are now starting to go down. And again, it can only go to zero, but that's a risk you take. Where a bond, you've got a guaranteed fixed income with a guaranteed outcome, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12%. I did talk about inverse performance a little bit earlier when it comes to the short side, and then taxes. So you do have, this is one thing I am going to touch on a little bit more, is the tax perspective of some of these investments. So if you have stocks, you have capital gains tax. So if I buy a stock, $1,000 worth of stock, and I sell it for $2,000, that $1,000 that I made is a capital gains. Short-term capital gains, there's long-term capital gains, and really simple. If it's short-term, it's you've held it less than a year. If it's long-term, you've held it more than a year, which is why Warren Buffett has a much lower effective tax rate than a lot of people at 10%, because his portfolio has been around a long time. He goes off long-term capital gains, not short. He takes $1 as his W-2 salary, and pockets the rest. So again, not anything illegal, just using the tax code as the most efficient way possible. As far as bond risk, if you're buying in T-bills from the United States government, you'd have to assume that the government's going to go bankrupt, which in all reality, it already has. Okay, how to choose between stocks and bonds. Stocks represent ownership, like I said, in a company, and there's performance tied to that company, and bonds are just a loan from a company or a government with a fixed interest rate. Okay. One of the final things we're going to go over is mutual funds. So we talked about stocks and bonds. We've talked about the difference there. We talked about diversification. Mutual funds play into that because you're investing in a big pool of resources, a big pool of stocks and bonds, actually. This allows you to diversify, which I talked about earlier. It helps from a tax perspective because you're not going all in on one stock, and you're not getting hammered in taxes, because you'll probably have a more long-term exposure rating if you're looking at something like a mutual fund. And it makes it really simple to invest in. So a lot of people go, I don't know which stock to buy. It's easier just to buy a mutual fund and be done with it. You've also heard me talk about ETFs. The difference between an ETF and a mutual fund is ETFs can be traded multiple times a day. A mutual fund cannot. It's usually at the end of the day or at the end of the week, where ETFs can be, stocks inside that ETF can be moved in and out It can be moved in and out as needed. Okay. This is one of the tax advantages. They do offer a lot of tax advantages. So tax deferred growth, tax-free dividends, tax efficient investing. It just depends on your tax situation. Make sure you're consulting with an accountant before you are a certified financial planner before you do this. I am not an accountant or a CFP, so make sure you do your own due diligence. Okay. So we went through 5 financial topics, 5 financial concepts that a lot of people may not understand. This is very baseline stuff. I'm going to link the presentation down in the description, as well as a list of some of my favorite places to learn. If you're just starting out and you're looking for places, to go, I'm going to link that down in the description. But be honest, write in the comments, let me know how many of these did you know? How many of these could you recite offhand? And what's your favorite concept that I listed here? And as always, don't